So to factorize the left side of this equation, we get ready the two brackets, each with x plus a number, and we know that those two numbers must be factors of -2, the constant term. And now that we know the factors of -2 can either be -1 times 2 or 1 times -2, let's start trying out these factors here. Now, to decide whether it is -1 and 2 or 1 and -2, we know that the product of these two numbers must give -2, whereas the sum of the two numbers must give -1, must give the number in front of x. So the way then is to add up the two factors to check whether we can get -1. So let's do that. -1 plus 2 is equal to 1. So the first pair is not correct. Next one, 1 plus -2 is -1, which is correct, which is the same as the number in front of x. So the correct pair should be 1 and -2. So let's write that down, 1 and -2. So the number is added to the x, so we have x plus 1 here, and here we have x plus -2, which is just the same as x minus 2. And then, since we have the two brackets now, these are the factors of the left hand side. So that means that this product is the same as the left hand side, and the right hand side is equal to 0. What we have now is the factorization. We have a bracket times a bracket equals to 0, and we have already seen how to work with this. We have seen that when you have a number times a number that gives 0, one or the other number must be 0. So in this case, x plus 1 is 0, or x minus 2 is 0. In this way, we have two new equations that we can solve. So x plus 1 equals to 0. To find x, we must get rid of the 1. We minus 1 from both sides, and that gives x minus 1 as one possible answer. Likewise, x minus 2 equals to 0. We add 2 to both sides to get rid of the minus 2 there. So on the right side, we get 2. So the answers for x are minus 1 or minus 2. And you should always double check by substituting each of these into the original equation to check that the left hand side is equal to the right hand side, to check that the equation is satisfied. Now, it is possible to have simultaneous equations that give rise to quadratic equation. So this is a slightly more difficult kind of problem. Let's look at one example. We have two equations here. Each equation contains two unknowns, x and y. So this is just the simultaneous equations that we have seen before, but with a difference. The simultaneous equations that we have seen before would have x plus y or x minus y, or with some numbers in front of them. In this case, in the second equation, we have x times y, and not just x plus y or minus y. So we have a multiplication between the x and y. Now this makes things more difficult. Now, let's start by putting numbers for each equation. So I'll call that equation 1 and equation 2. In order to do this, we have to make use of a method called substitution. Okay, I'll just show you how to do it, starting from 2. Okay, I'll start from 2. We can start from 1 as well, but if I start from 2, what I want to do in the first step is to make y the subject, to choose one of them and make that the subject. I'm going to choose y. So in 2, we want to make y the subject. So that means we want to rearrange equation 2 so that we only have y on one side and all the other things on the other side. In this case, we have x times y on the left side. So we want to get rid of the y. We want to get rid of the x. To do that, we divide both sides by x. Let me write that down again. So I'll divide both sides by x. And you can see that when I do that, the x and the x cancels, so that only y is left. So y is equal to 2 over x. So this is a new arrangement. We have just made y the subject. I'll call the equation 3. And the next step is to substitute this expression for y into the first equation. I'll use my own symbol where I draw an arrow pointing to 1, just to show that I'm going to put this expression for y into 1. Now in 1 we have x plus y on the left side. Let's write that down. X plus. Now instead of writing down y from the first equation, I'm going to replace it by this formula for y, because we have just found that y is equal to 2 over x. So that's like a formula. I'm going to substitute 2 over x in to the y there. That's 2 over x. equals to 3 on the right hand side. So now I have an equation with just x. There is no y in this equation. So we can now try and solve for x. Now this is a form that looks different from quadratic equations. We have an x at the bottom of a fraction. That makes it look a bit more difficult. But remember, when we solve equations, when we solve this kind of equations, if we see a fraction, one possible way to simplify the equation is to get rid of the numbers at the bottom of the fractions. Get rid of the denominators. And we can do that simply by multiplying both sides by the numbers at the bottom. Now in this case we have just the x at the bottom, so what we could do is to multiply both sides of the equation by x. So let me do that. Now, I'll just write it out here again. X plus 2x equals 3. I'm going to multiply both sides by x, like this, right? As before, be careful of to tell the difference between x and the multiplication sign. They look the same, and I try to make them different by using a curly x. Alright, instead of the cross, which I just use for the multiplication. Now remember that when you multiply the sum of two terms by x, you must multiply x by each of these terms and not just the x, because we are really supposed to do the sum before multiplying by x. Okay, so you can't just multiply x by the first term and forget the second term. So multiplying each of these terms by x, we have x times x gives x squared plus x times 2 over x. So the x here and the x at the bottom cancels. We are left with 2. And on the right side we have 3 times x equals to 3x. Now it's beginning to look like a quadratic equation. Actually it is a quadratic equation. Now let's rearrange it to make it look like the familiar form. You remember what the familiar form is. It always has 0 on the right side. So let me get rid of the 3x from the right side so as to turn it to 0. I'll do that by subtracting 3x from both sides. So I've subtracted 3x on the left side and get a minus 3x there. And on the right side, when we subtract 3x from 3x, we just get 0. And there we have our familiar quadratic equation. So and in the next step, to solve for this equation, we use factorization. So we can go through the steps, write down the 2 brackets, find the factors of 2, and try to work out the answer. Let's do that. Zero on that side, so we have an x there and an x there, and there are 2 numbers that we need to find. So let me write down the possible factors for 2. So 2 can be just 1 times 2. That's simple enough. But remember that the sum of those two factors must give the number in front of x. Now in this case, the sum of the two factors, 1 plus 2 is equal to 3. But the number in front of x is minus 3 and not 3. So there is a minus sign there. So that makes things a little bit more tricky. The way to do it is to say that 1 times 2 can be equal to 2. Minus 1 times minus 2 can also be equal to 2 because the minus and the minus cancel. So that gives us another possible case. So this time, if we add the factors, if we add minus 1 to minus 2, we'll get minus 3, which is correct, which is the same as the number in front of the x term. So that means minus 1, minus 2 are the correct numbers to use. Let's write these down, minus 1, minus 2. Alright, and each of these is to be added to the x. Alright, since there's a minus sign, x plus minus 1 is just the same as x minus 1. In the same way, we have x minus 2 in the other brackets. So now we have the factors. We have just factorized it. We have the two factors. This bracket times this bracket is equal to 0. So each of this bracket must, well, one or the other of the bracket must be equal to 0. Let's write that down. X minus 1 must be 0, or x minus 2 must be 0. So now we have two simpler equations that we can solve. X minus 1 equal to 0. The answer is x equal to 1. Alright, in simple cases like this, you can either go through the same steps in algebra where you add 1 to both sides, or move minus 1 to the other side and change its sign to get 1. Or you can just look at it and say, I have x minus 1, and I can guess that if x is 1, then 1 minus 1 is 0. So x is just 1. So for simple cases like this, you can often do it just by making a guess. So in this case, for example, if x minus 2 is 0, what is x? Now we know that 2 minus 2 is 0. So if you can think of that, then x would be 2. X equals 2 is the answer, because 2 minus 2 is 0. So therefore, the answers are 1 or 2. Now there are also problems that can give rise to quadratic equations. Right? Real world problems and not just problems from simultaneous equations. So let's look at an example. Let's look at the floor area of a room. Right? We have a rectangular room. Now we are given that the area is 12 meter squared. Right? We are also given that one side is longer than the other side by 1 meter. So that means that the longer minus the shorter side is 1 meter. So the problem is to find the sides. What are the lengths of each side of this room? So the length and the width. These are what we want to find. And that's our problem. In order to solve this problem, let's use algebra. So let's start by saying, right, we let the shorter side be x. So if the shorter side is x, then we know that the longer side minus the shorter side is equal to 1. That means that the longer side must be x plus 1. The longer side must be longer than x by 1 meter. Right? So it must be x plus 1. And we know that the area is equal to 12 meters squared, and area is the length times the width. Okay, so therefore x plus 1 times x must be equal to 12. So now we have our equation. Let's simplify that. First, we remove the brackets. Now be careful, you cannot just look at these two terms here, the bracket times the x, and say that either this bracket or x must be 0. Just because the left side looks like a factorized form. Right? Because the right side in this case is not 0. Not yet. We have to do some work first. So in the first step, let's remove the bracket. Okay, we have a bracket times x. So when we remove the bracket, we must multiply x by each term in the bracket. So x times x is x squared, x times 1 is x, and this is equal to 12. So now let's make the right side 0 to turn it into the familiar form. just subtract 12 from both sides. There. We have our familiar form. And we have our quadratic equation. To solve this equation, we can try and factorize the left side. Let's try that. Let's get ready two brackets. Now the number in front of x squared is 1. So we can put down x and x in the bracket. And we have to find the two numbers, the number in each bracket. Now the product of these two numbers have to give the constant term, the number minus 12. So let's write down the possible factors for minus 12. Let me write it down here. So 12 minus 12 can be minus 1 times 12 minus 2 times 6 minus 3 times 4. Okay, or instead of minus 1 times 12, we can also have the other have it the other way around. We can have 1 times minus 12. Okay, so likewise for each of this case. Now I can make it. Okay, let me just make it easier. If I just continue writing, minus 4 times 3 minus 6 times 2 and minus 12 times 1. So now I have all possible cases. For example, I have minus 1 times 12 as well as minus 12 times 1, the other way around. So we have all these possible combinations. So now we need to choose one of them. And the way to choose is that the sum of the two factors must be equal to the number in front of x. In this case, it's just plus x, so that means plus 1x. So we need to add each pair of factors together and see which pair gives us 1. So let's start. Minus 1 plus 12. That's not 1. Minus 2 plus 6, no. Minus 3 plus 4, yes. Minus 3 plus 4 is equal to 1. So therefore, that is the correct combination. Let's fill in the blanks, which are minus 3 and 4. Alright, and these should be added to the x. So I should have a plus sign there. Now we are nearly there. We then say that we have the two factors which multiply to give 0. So each of these factor, one or the other factor must be 0. Let's write that. So minus x minus 3 is 0, or x plus 4 is 0. And now we have two simpler equations that we can solve. So x minus 3 is 0. So we can do the usual steps, or you can just look at x minus 3 and say that, right, 3 minus 3 is 0. Right, so x must be 3. So this is a quick guess, just because you know that 3 minus 3 is 0. It's a quick guess that can give us the answer right away. So likewise, if we have x plus 4 equals to 0, What is x? Well, minus 4 plus 4 is 0. So with this connection, we know that x must be minus 4, right? Because minus 4 plus 4 is 0. So we have these two answers, x is 3 or x is minus 4. Now, so one last thing I should say, which is quite important, is that if we are just given this equation to solve, then 3 or minus 4 would be the answer. However, in this case, we are given a problem. We are given a problem of a room, and we must find the length and the width. This means that the answer that we are supposed to get, remember what x was. X was supposed to be the width of the room. So the answer that we get should give us the width of the room, alright, in a certain number of meters. Now if you look at these two answers, what it's telling us is that the width of the room is 3 meters or minus 4 meters. Now if you think about it, minus 4 meters does not make sense. How can you have a room that is a negative number of meters? Right? That can't be real. That can't be right. A room must have a certain number of meters long or wide, and that can't be a negative number. So therefore, the minus 4 in this case must be wrong. It is not wrong as an answer to this equation, but it is just not right for this problem. Right? It's not the right answer for this problem. And the only right answer is therefore 3. So therefore, we reject this and say that the width is 3 meters. Therefore, the length, we know that the length is x plus 1, is longer than the width by 1 meter. So the length is just 3 plus 1, which is 4 meters.